Hello, folks. Welcome to the Historian Stamtish. And today I'm delighted to say we have Professor Alan Lester of the University of Sussex with us. And he's a world expert of empire and colonial history. And we're going to talk to him about his specialism and his expertise. Alan, please, could you give us a short background?
Hi, Philip. Thanks very much for having me on. So I'm Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex, and for the last sort of 35 years, I've been straddling geography and histories of the British Empire. So I began my PhD was on the origins of apartheid in South Africa and tracking back some of the foundations into the British colonial period. I then had a phase of my career where I was looking at settler colonialism in Australia and New Zealand, as well as South Africa. And much of my thinking has been about the networks through which various imperial projects were pursued and that connected one part of an empire to another. Projects such as settler colonialism, humanitarianism, governmentality, and the ways in which the people pursuing these projects have reshaped both colonial space and Britain in their pursuit of those projects. And I guess in more recent years, which we may come to focus on a bit later, I've been using some of that knowledge acquired over 30 odd years of doing research on the British Empire to contest some of the misrepresentations and falsehoods about empire that have characterized the recent culture wars and political debates over the past in Britain.
So, if I could take you back to the very beginning, what made you choose that direction? I mean, obviously, like the rest of us, perhaps you went through the A-level system and you're going through the UCAS and blah blah blah. What made you eventually go down the colonial route?
Well, initially, when I was choosing A levels, I wanted to do history, but we had a really awful teacher who was later sacked for abuse, who would have been my history teacher. So one of those chance fate, things sent me to do geography instead of history. But I always had an interest in the more historical sides of geography, and I was really lucky. I got into Cambridge to do geography at a time when the department had a really strong historical geography contingent. So I chose as many historically orientated geography courses as I could, people like Mark Billinge and Derek Gregory, Robin Glasscock, and so on. And at the same time, I was really fascinated by the film Zulu, of all things, which I first watched when I was about 11. While my friends were playing Cowboys and Indians, I was playing Zulus and Redcoats. And I'd been reading throughout this period about why British soldiers were at Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift and fighting in the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879. And at Cambridge, I was again lucky enough to get a bursary to do my undergraduate dissertation to go on field work. So I went to South Africa, and this was in 1988. And I went full of good intentions to spend my time there in the archives, working on the role of trade in the rise of the Zulu kingdom. But I immediately made some friends who were black students, whom the University of Natal, as it was then, was admitting against the law. This was supposedly a whites only university under apartheid. And those black students took me under their wing and made the most of having a visitor from Britain to educate me about life under apartheid in the hope that I would come back to Britain and tell people what they were going through. So I saw some pretty horrendous things. This was during the period in which the late apartheid government was trying to cling to power by sponsoring what they called black on black violence around Natal, around Pietermaritzburg, where I was based. And many of my new friends were members of the UDF, the United Democratic Front, which was effectively the kind of internal presence of the now banned and exiled ANC. Um, and eventually, I had to leave some of the situations that they were showing me because it was too dangerous for them, having me there as a visible white person. But anyway, I came back fired up to try to find out, to research how such an abhorrent, explicitly racialized system of governance had become implemented in the first place. So that was what then led me to do my PhD while I was teaching. I couldn't afford to do a PhD full time, so I was teaching in a secondary school and did my PhD part time on these antecedents for apartheid, which drew me more and more into the world of the British Empire in the late 19th century originally.
When you were doing your PhD, um, how challenging was that? Because you were working during the day. I know a lot of older students turn to doing a PhD when they're still working. It'd just be interesting to hear your comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was challenging, but at the same time, looking back on it now, I don't think I would have written it so efficiently or effectively if I had had all the time in the world. I I was reading like crazy during free periods, and I was using the holidays, the teachers' holidays, which is reasonably generous, to just immerse myself in the archives and in the secondary literature, and I think I kind of had to make the most of every moment that was available to me to work on it. And there was also a kind of a big incentive. I didn't mind school teaching, but I knew that really I wanted to be a lecturer. I wanted to have the space and the freedom to teach my own specialism, rather than glaciers in A-level geography or whatever, stuff that I was really interested in. And so there was that was my kind of escape route, getting the PhD done, and then being able to apply for jobs in universities was the kind of incentive, as well as just the sheer interest, as I've explained, in trying to understand this phenomenon of a segregationist and an apartheid society, which you can only do in a colonial context. So I think, yeah, I did it. I had 5 years to do it. Then you could register for 5 years as a part-time student. I actually did it in four, and then I had to wait to submit it for a while. But I'm sure I wouldn't have had that kind of fire in my belly if I'd been a full-time student.
So, going back then, what was your first publication? Was it a paper or a book?
It was part of the PhD thesis.
Right,
So it was a book called From Colonization to Democracy, A New Historical Geography of South Africa. So it was a kind of overview, mostly based on the secondary literature that I'd covered. And my PhD was registered at the Institute of Education, now part of UCL in
right.
London. So I did
Okay.
it through that while I was teaching. So there was an educational component to it as well, which I didn't publish. But the kind of overview of South Africa's historical geography was what I published as the first book. Yeah.
And did you go straight to Sussex or?
No, no. After my first job in higher education was at St Mary's College in Twickenham, in London, and I was there for 5 years, further 5 years, working on academic articles and publishing that book. And the next book, I think, was mostly written while I was there. And then, yeah, I moved to Sussex in 2000. So I've been here 25 years now.
Wow. So if I could just take you back over the period of the time before you became political, if we go to the period of how colonial history was taught in university, how it was expanded, how it's been written about, if you just give us a little summary of how colonial history has developed before it became all involved in all the politics that we have today, just to
Yeah, it's
sort
really
of
good.
clarify our minds to know what the foundations are
Yeah,
in
that's a really
colonial
good
history.
way of setting things up before we get into the more recent stuff. Yeah, because the field was changing. It was a really exciting time to be working in that field. Something called the New Imperial History was beginning basically from the kind of late 80s, early 90s onwards. And it was led by women scholars, women historians, who were both feminist and acutely aware of racism in British history. One of the leading forces was Catherine Hall, and through her partnership with Stuart Hall, the great black cultural critic, she was immersed in issues of race and connections with Jamaica, but she was also an historian of modern Britain and brought those two things together with an analysis of the way that the colonial culture developing on the plantation societies and post-plantation societies of Jamaica was intricately tied up with modern British history, and the new imperial history as a whole was making this argument that for too long there'd been this great gulf between historians of Britain and historians of the empire. They were like two separate streams, almost mini departments in their own right in some universities, as if they had an imperial history section. So Britain was taught as one entity, the empire was taught as another. And this new imperial history, through the work of people like Catherine Hall, Rinalini Sinha, Antoinette Burton, Kathleen Wilson, was reconfiguring those relationships by saying that it's ridiculous to take British history as an island constrained story. You know, that even as J.R. Seeley, the first, widely acknowledged as the first imperial historian, first historian of the British Empire, acknowledged back in the 1880s, England's story is an international story. It took place as much in the Americas and in India and elsewhere around the world as it did in Britain. So the new imperial history is starting to find all of these sorts of ways, culturally mainly and politically, in which the act of colonizing reshaped Britishness itself. And for a long time, it was mostly focused on issues of gender, race, and class, mainly in the cultural spheres and the political spheres. More recently, economic historians have been much more interested in the economic co-construction of Britain and Empire too. But it was a time of great interest for someone like me who was coming into the field of history from this geographical background, from a geography background, because so much more of it was focused on these great geographical connections, these interconnections between places. And in parallel within geography, I was learning about the work of people like Doreen Massey, who was adopting a much more sort of exciting and innovative way of conceiving of space and place, conceiving of places not so much in her imagery as kind of discrete billiard balls arranged on a table, which is space itself, but more as trajectories that come together at any one time to shape any one place.
Mhm.
And she wrote a paper, a great example of a road in London and all of the various influences that came together at any one time to constitute that road. Immigrants from different parts of the world, flows of capital from different parts of the world, signage, language from different parts of the world, and made the case that history shouldn't just be about temporality, it's also about spatiality. It's about how places at any given time are made by all of these intersecting trajectories of people, ideas, capital, texts, and so on. So much of my work was really kind of at the intersection, I guess, between that kind of Doreen Massey way of thinking of place and space as trajectories and the new imperial history way of thinking about Britain and empire constantly influencing one another, Britain and its colonies, metropole and periphery, constantly in interaction. And so I saw kind of an area that I was quite keen to explore. So my next book after that publication of part of a PhD thesis was called Imperial Networks. And it was trying to utilize some of these insights to understand British colonialism in South Africa in the 19th century.
Just from a public perspective of that time, I recall there were two programs on Time Watch. I don't know how people treat Time Watch now, but back in the day, there would be serious historians coming on talking about subjects professionally and as academics. And there were two that come to mind. One was on the African slave trade, where they actually went and studied and showed and they examined. And the second one that kind of followed afterwards was about what happened after the slave trade to the labor, the slaves. And I was fascinated to see how they were called indentured servants and indentured labor. And that, I know it's slightly jumping ahead, but that idea of being controlled but not slaves struck me as a very significant factor in the history of empire, which then just suddenly stopped. And the whole discussion around it kind of ended. There it was, and then there it wasn't. And I just wondered, is that my impression or have I missed something?
Yeah, it's a really good observation really, because a lot more of this kind of critical work on empire was being generated through these new lenses that were brought to bear on it, particularly the lens of race and racial discrimination as a bedrock of empire. And that kind of whole post-slavery moment was beginning to be explored, the way in which formerly enslaved people, once emancipated, became apprentices in the first instance, and the way in which their labour was supplemented by indentured workers brought mainly from India. That was all becoming to be part of the story. But one of the kind of ironic twists, I guess, of the backlash against opening up those histories has been the stimulus to do even more research on them. So, in recent years, we know a lot more about that immediate post-emancipation moment. Um, so, for instance, we know a lot more about what happened to the so-called liberated Africans. Now, these were captives being trafficked across the Atlantic as part of the transatlantic slave trade by other countries once Britain had abolished its own slave trade. And once Britain had established a West Africa squadron to try and intercept other countries' slave ships and put down the slave trade. So, in the kind of popular history of the British Empire, the kind of self comforting narrative, these captives who were seized by Royal Navy ships and liberated from other countries' ships were freed. But we now know a lot more about the ways in which they were not freed. They were assigned as unpaid apprentices for up to 14 years in most cases to wherever their labour was required around the British Empire. So they were not freed once they were intercepted from other countries' slave ships. Many of them actually ended up on the same slave plantations working alongside enslaved labour until such time as slavery itself was abolished in 1833, and then they merged into the formerly enslaved population. So there were all sorts of techniques that we used to maintain white former planters and elsewhere white investors' control of black people's labour after abolition. And it's the beginnings of telling these stories that challenge, very long held, complacent British views about the benevolence of empire, I think, that has been one of the things stimulating such a backlash among nationalists recently who don't want these stories told.
I mean, this is just off the top of my head, and it's only thinking about what you've just said. So once the slave trade has ended, there's an informal slavery. And then on top of that, if I'm not mistaken, all of those prisoners who were exported to places like Australia were in a form of indentured slavery. So it's not like everything has stopped in human cargo. Human cargoes have continued, but with different labels.
Yeah, I mean, there's that's absolutely true, and there's lots of different forms of coerced labour that are continuing after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. So first of all, you've got these so-called liberated Africans, now called recaptives by historians, because that's a more accurate reflection of what happened to them, taken out of the holds of other countries' slave ships, but then assigned by courts of commission to wherever their labour was needed and continuing in an unpaid labouring function. So that's one form of coerced labour that continues. You've then got that indentured form of labour, which sort of straddles the boundary between coerced and voluntary. And that's largely planters in the Caribbean and then the Pacific and in Australia liaising with the East India Company and the Colonial Office to bring impoverished workers from India on these contracts of indenture, 5 to 7 years usually, after which time they will be free either to go back to India or to stay on in the colony. That starts off in the late 1830s as almost indistinguishable from slavery. So many of these indentured workers are recruited through false pretenses, or they're simply kidnapped. But there are reforms which take place in the early 1840s, which mean that thereafter it sort of straddles this kind of voluntary coerced line, with economic circumstances being the main form of coercion. Then you've got a third form of forced labour, which is what happens to the transported convicts sent to Australia, that's known as assignment. So what happens there is that while they're serving out their sentences, they are assigned to free settlers to provide free labour for them. The pretext being that those free settlers' influence over them as their overseers and as their masters will help to redeem them and rehabilitate them before they get their tickets of leave and mostly join in with the settler population. But then there's a fourth dimension to the continuation of coerced labour after the abolition of the slave trade by Britain, and that is that you still have an extra 2 million African captives who are trafficked across the Atlantic and who evade the British patrols. So broadly, during the course of the 18th century, just prior to abolition in 1807, uh, the British slave trade had come to dominate in West Africa above the equator. The Portuguese and Brazilian and Spanish slave trade had been pushed further and further south. And after 1807, the West Africa squadron that's intercepting these other countries' slave ships is virtually powerless south of the equator. So you still have a flourishing illegal slave trade. Portugal itself has been cajoled into abolishing its slave trade, but it's widely ignored. So you still have 2 million Africans taken across the Atlantic to Brazil and to Cuba and to some of them to the southern states of the USA, which of course still has slavery too, after British abolition. And during that period, you have the cotton mills and textile mills of Yorkshire and Lancashire using cotton that's grown by these captives who are taken to the Americas as part of this illicit trade and grown by the generations that have been born into slavery in the southern US states and in Brazil. So you still have a British economy, an industrializing economy, flourishing through the use of slave labor, even after the abolition of the slave trade. And I think the other dimension to that story of abolition, while I'm on it, I might as well add here, that is only really beginning to come to light, to public light at least, is how anti-slavery, which is still laudable in its own right, better to have anti-slavery than a continuation of the slave trade. No one's denying that. But how the suppression of the slave trade by Britain in particular was used to gain further territory in Africa. So, in a way, abolition is the prelude to the scramble for Africa because it's on the pretext of putting down African forms of slavery, domestic slavery, that Britain takes control of ever greater swathes of West Africa in particular. And the people who benefit from that are British investors in the palm oil industry, in the ivory trade, and in mineral exploitation. And all of that is going on. Similarly, in East Africa, the suppression of the Zanzibari slave trade and the suppression of what's known as Arab trafficking often serves British economic and geopolitical interests just as well. So anti-slavery is both a sincere project believed in by many humanitarian Britons and a way of other British interests securing material and geopolitical objectives through expanding empire, even in the prelude to the scramble for Africa.
Would it be fair to extend what you've just mentioned about the cotton mills to the poor people who had to work in those factories? Because surely their lives are not really made much better for working in those factories. There was a constant fight for political representation right the way through till what 1918 even, and and the salaries such as they were and the conditions that they were working for. I mean, okay, they had the Factory Act and all of that, but those conditions remained severe right until the 1950s.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's various ways of approaching that question of the relationship between the conditions of the British working classes in these industrial regions and enslavement in the Caribbean. One thing to note is that there could be great affinity between those groups. So many of the industrial workers in Britain signed the anti-slavery petitions. They were in support of abolition and emancipation. During the 1850s, Frederick Douglass, the great African American anti-slavery campaigner, was fated when he visited the cotton mills, the cotton towns of Lancashire. Workers came out in support of the abolition of slavery in the USA in the lead up to the Civil War there. Um, Slavery was also used as a kind of a metaphor to campaign for improved conditions in Britain. So, workers spoke about themselves being treated like slaves in order to agitate for improved conditions. The danger of those making those kind of connections between slavery in the Caribbean and slavery here, and we've seen this manifest in the current culture wars and in the kind of right wing backlash against revealing this history, is the idea that there was no difference between the slavery of Africans in the Caribbean and the treatment of the British working classes. So when you're talking about these histories of transatlantic slavery, nowadays you're often confronted by someone saying, yeah, but conditions were no worse, were no better rather, for industrial workers in Lancashire. And that's where you do have to point out that these were completely separate modes of being and relationships to employers and owners. That British kids were used in mines, in factories, going up chimneys and so on. Conditions were dire, industrial accidents were rife. Women were often sexually abused by employers. All of that is true, but these people were not chattel. Their children would not be born into slavery. They weren't taken captive and stripped from their communities and trafficked to another continent in the holds of a ship in the first place. They couldn't be punished at will and raped at will by their owners without any legal recourse. So although things like that did happen, there was legal recourse, which most of the time could be used to punish um, culprits. But in the world of the Jamaican plantation, for instance, if you look at the diaries of an owner like Thomas Thistlewood, rape, abuse, torture, mutilation, all of this was routine. All of it was sanctioned to a greater or lesser extent by the whole community. Someone like Thistlewood might have been seen as an outlier for his sheer sadism, but nevertheless, these people and their children were chattel. They could be treated in any way that the owner wanted. Um, and children could be taken from their parents and sold, never to be seen again, and sent to another plantation or another island. So we can, by all means, sort of make associations between the British working classes and enslaved people and see where the connections occurred and where slavery was used as a metaphor. But we mustn't fall into the trap of false equivalencies between their
Now,
conditions.
I was actually thinking more that what the empire was fueling was the means to further control the working class. I
Mm.
was thinking more of it in terms of a political issue rather than a political economic issue rather than so much comparative social situations and conditions of work. I mean, I mean, there can't be any comparison between a really fair comparison between a poor slave in on a South American cotton plantation and a factory worker in Oldham in Manchester area. But
Yeah.
but but I think I've always thought that the finance that was coming from the back from the empire was enabling the powers to make sure that there was no proper reform of the political and electoral systems. And I think of my family. My great grandfather wasn't able to rent a home until 1884. And you think, blimey, the first election, the electoral reform is 1832. And look at all the battle it took to get that. And still, by the end of the century, they're still having to wait to get their access. And I think an awful lot of that is down to the way the empire fueled financing of the political system to prevent any break in the status quo. That was my thinking.
Yeah, no, I wasn't accusing you of adopting that kind of false equivalency, but it happens in popular culture,
No,
certainly.
I guess.
But no, I think you're absolutely right that forms of class domination and exploitation in Britain are intimately connected with forms of racialized exploitation overseas, because it's often the same people who are doing it. So, we could talk at this point. I guess it fits in neatly about the role of transatlantic slavery in fueling the Industrial Revolution and that kind of ongoing relationship between the Caribbean, especially in a transatlantic plantation complex, and British industrial and political change. So, much of the work under the new imperial history and subsequently still ongoing now, still finding out much more about this, is looking at the ways in which the capital acquired through transatlantic slavery fed into stimulating the Industrial Revolution. And this is one of the most controversial areas of the culture wars, with those on the right wanting to minimize any understanding that the Industrial Revolution, that Britain's genius for industrial growth, the first industrial revolution in world history, was somehow connected to enslavement. Um, but something like sort of 10, 11% of GDP in the late 18th century came from this Atlantic plantation complex, not just slave trading, that was a minor part of it, the actual trafficking, but from the profits made on sugar, tobacco, cotton, cultivation, and so on. Um, it wasn't just about the sheer amount of money coming into Britain, though. It was about what was done with it. So a lot of this input from the Atlantic world was invested in the Atlantic facing regions of Britain, which were the industrializing regions. So we know that disproportionately much of that income was going into the first factories, the first textile factories, into railway development slightly later. The boost that was given when slave owners were compensated for the loss of their property, much of that was invested in railway development. And there were concentrations of industrial activity that mapped very well onto concentrations of slave ownership on those sort of western facing, Atlantic facing sides of Britain. So it's often the same people who are engaged in the transatlantic slave economy and who are leading the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And in parallel with their transformation of both the Atlantic world and Britain sort of concurrently, you've got the British working classes beginning to mobilize, E.P. Thompson's classic sort of formulation, the making of the English working class, beginning to become conscious of a certain unifying condition relationship to capital and to employers. And you've got the Chartist movement from the 1830s beginning to mobilize a new constituency to be included in the electorate. And as you say, there was a broadening of the electorate in 1832, the 1832 Reform Act, but a very marginal one. So, the proportion of adults who could vote increased from something like 2% to something like 4.6%, I think it is. Um, but crucially, the complexion of that electorate was altered. So the old aristocratic landowning interest lost influence, and these new bourgeois industrialists, commercially orientated merchants gained influence. And that has an effect on empire too. These things are always relational. So that new interest in Parliament enables the abolition of slavery. You've got a new tranche of anti-slavery MPs who want to see free labour, the Adam Smith idea, believing that it will be more productive, as well as having moral objections to slavery. And you've got a tranche of new industrialists and merchants who want to be able to trade to India outside the auspices of the East India Company's monopoly. So you've got the end of the East India Company's monopoly and the end of the slave trade and slavery itself, and the beginnings of reform within Britain going hand in hand. And from then on, as you indicate, it's a continual struggle by lower middle class and working classes excluded from this property-based franchise in 1832 to extend the parameters of the franchise through the later 19th century. And this idea, Catherine Hall's work is very good on this. The idea that underpins this is responsibility for self-government. Which constituencies, which groups in British society and in colonial society can be considered responsible enough to be given the vote? And in Britain, during the course of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, those groups who are seen as having the capacity, this kind of level of civilization to exercise that responsibility, gradually expands and ultimately includes even women, from 1918, women of a certain age in 1918. Whereas in the empire, there's this continual debate among Britons and between Britons and indigenous elites about racial qualification
Hmm.
to exercise that responsibility to govern oneself. And you can see how it plays out when self-governance is granted to different colonies. And by the time the empire collapses in the mid 20th century, the only colonies with full self-governance, the ability to elect their own parliaments and govern themselves entirely internally, are the white settler colonies, because it's only white people who are seen as trustworthy, responsible enough to exercise that vote. So by then, working class men are already included in Britain, but race is the fundamental barrier in the empire. India comes the closest before independence to self-governance. By the 1930s, only a decade or so before independence, Indians are finally granted the right to elect representatives to provincial government. But all the way through, self-determination from India has been blocked purely on the grounds that Indians are not fit yet to govern themselves. There's this sort of perpetual deferral of the moment in which they might be considered responsible enough.
But you do see, even after there's mass representation, you do see attempts by governments to kind of control things. I'm thinking back in the day with the poll tax, applying wealth, and now there's this idea of identity on voting and having identity cards. I think we continually go back to old colonial ideas and methods without really thinking about it. I mean, that's only my impression from here, but I'm looking back and thinking, oh my God, are we going to go through all of that again?
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're right. There are kind of particularly elites in British society who have got used to governing populations, and that exercise of governing populations has been both inwardly focused in Britain and outwardly focused through empire for over 200, 300 years. So it's not surprising that the governance of populations, you see many of the same techniques, many of the same methods, and thinking about how to control you know, unwieldy, disagreeable elements of populations can work.
Well, I just think it's very interesting how, although the mechanisms may have broken down, been removed, banned, whatever, the culture still creeps in. That certain attitudes still creep in, words, vocabulary, behavior patterns, the idea of, you know, zero contracts making people work virtually for nothing. Um, those ideas of the past come back in a different form and impose the similar kind of regimes of unpleasantness. We don't seem to have gone from the positive 90s where we seem to be going somewhere. We seem to be backtracking all the time, going back to some past, which I'm not sure at that time, back in the past, it worked.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's certainly a correlation between a more sort of permissive and humane employment regime within Britain and the periods when Britain as a whole is prospering. The counter side to that, of course, the irony is that much of that prospering is at the expense of colonies and of post colonies in the wider world. And it's when conditions in Britain, when capitalism reaches a crisis within Britain, like after the 2008 banking crisis, that you start to see that sort of inward extension of pleasantry rode back upon
Yeah.
and conditions more akin to the kinds of exploitation that Britons have always been able to benefit from overseas, appearing at home within the domestic economy too, I think.
But so we're now going to, I think we're slightly edging our way towards the inevitable, which is to talk about the present day battles of colonial history, finding the space and everything. Do you look at what happened in 2008, and obviously there was lots of discussions about what the future of capitalism led to Brexit. Then there was all the debates in 2019. Just looking at those and then looking back, do you think somewhere along that period between 2008 and 2019, the whole spirit of the 1990s, which was fairly dynamic, um, liberal, moving forward, advancing ideas in academia, did that seem to just disappear?
Yeah, I think broadly, yes. Obviously, the story is complicated of how that change, that sort of seismic shift has happened. But I think you're right that they initially the banking crisis and then the crisis of global capitalism really after 2008 was a stimulus to a reconfiguration. Um, and it led to greater indebtedness on the part of the British government, which in turn feeds into less capacity to be generous with government expenditure and public services. Um, into that context came, you've always got this mixture of kind of structural continuities and immediate contingencies. And one of these immediate contingencies was David Cameron's decision to sort out once and for all the Eurosceptics in the Tory party by delivering on a promise of a referendum on membership of the EU. That in itself proved decisive in introducing an entirely new factor, I think, into this general sense of malaise after 2008. And that new factor was the complete binary split that a referendum produces. Unlike a general election, it's yes or no. And the politicking that went around that campaign, the opportunism on the part of people like Boris Johnson, who I don't think was seriously committed either way, but was looking at the issue in terms of self-interest. And his opportunism in jumping onto the Brexit bandwagon and helping to propagandize for the Leave vote, I think was decisive in shifting it just over the line, just over the 50% that was required. And that decision having been taken and the British electorate having been split almost down the middle, um, brought out all sorts of tensions within British society that had been confused and overlapping. And it kind of clarified and crystallized these tensions, producing two groups much more at each other's throats, much more seeing the other as an enemy. So, whereas before these groups might have differed in varying ways on varying subjects, and there was no kind of crystallizing separation. I think Brexit served that purpose of producing these two constituencies in British society. And those divisions are still with us. They're the template for the culture wars that ensued. And in the wake of the Brexit vote, the Conservative government that had seen it through, ultimately Boris Johnson's government, I think, concerned about the loss of support from that Brexit constituency and wanting to maintain it in order to maintain Conservative governance, started to see culture war as a way of retaining that block. So much of the culture war has been essentially about preserving the kind of electors who voted to leave the EU, playing upon their feelings of nationalism, patriotism, and crucially for my area, pride in the past, uh, identity politics, in other words. There's a lot of sort of accusation in the mirror in this kind of right-wing populist um, vote. They will complain about identity politics on the left without seemingly appreciating that this is precisely what they're promoting. But in the wake of the 2019 election, which Boris Johnson won on the back of this slogan, "Get Brexit Done," um, Black Lives Matter comes into play, and here is another trigger issue to divide these constituencies further. And I think the Conservative government-led backlash against Black Lives Matter, the rhetoric in the immediate aftermath was extreme. They were portraying Black Lives Matter as an aggressive African American import, because the resurgence of anti-racist activity had been prompted by the murder of George Floyd in America. They were pretending that this was purely an American issue, that there was no issue of structural racism in Britain that might motivate anti-racist demonstrators. So they wanted to dismiss Black Lives Matter. And I think the fact that so many, the protest in Bristol became iconic with the toppling of a statue of Edward Colston, a slave trader, into Bristol Harbour, that linked past and present in a way that itself served to sort of crystallise some of these lines of division. So the reaction against Black Lives Matter and the attempts to row back on all these historiographical tendencies we've been talking about. The attempt to go back to an uncritical, self-comforting, pat on the back view of empire, all became part of electoral politics as the Conservative government tried to retain what they called red wall votes. In other words, the largely Midlands and Northern voters who had traditionally been Labour, but who had swung behind the Conservatives in favour of Brexit. So, having created that sort of block of voters, culture war was the way of retaining their loyalty, particularly since the promises made during Brexit patently weren't going to come true. Britain was poorer, not richer as a result. And because Boris Johnson's promises of levelling up, huge investment in these relatively deprived areas, were also patently not going to come true. There simply wasn't the government financial headroom to do that. So the only way of retaining the loyalty of these so-called red wall pro-Brexit voting bloc was to pander to their sense of national identity being under threat from the woke, from the radicals, from the Black Lives Matter protesters, and then the targets expand: transgender people, and the latest scapegoated community is immigrants, and people seeking asylum. Whatever it is, wherever it's coming from, there's a threat to your identity as a white British person, proud of your country, proud of its past. You're being besieged, you're being attacked. The message is vote for us because we're the only ones who will defend you. And it's been an incredibly successful campaign. Um, I think partly because it's a transnational phenomenon. This isn't just in Britain. As you know full well, the right-wing populism, um, including far-right neo-Nazi elements, is resurgent across much of the Western world, basically the former Western empires and their colonial offshoots, and especially the USA, where obviously Trump's government is helping to ferment, to anchor, to provide resources, and to provide ideas and funding for this kind of propaganda that is working so well.
Can I just ask you, again, draw you back a bit to the period? Isn't parallel to the political developments that you're talking about up to 2019, isn't there something happening also in the history world where you have um, people like Niall Ferguson redefining what empire was and how positive it was, along with a whole host of other people who were um, on television programs offering an alternative colonialism. I'm not going to call it new colonialism, it's more of an alternative interpretation, largely based on generalities like Britain exported the English language, uh, that Britain exported Shakespeare. That it all appeared to me when I read some of this stuff and watched some of the programs, that it was a one-way empire. That empire was giving out all of these goodies, and the other bit, like the money coming in and the indentured slavery and blah blah, was kind of being masked away and forgotten about. This generous mother was giving out such
Yeah.
goodies. The whole world was benefiting from this one direction.
Yeah, no, I think what you're hinting at there is that part of a continuity of thinking about empire within Britain, which is very old, and it's a way of legitimizing Britain's imperial past for Britons in terms of a balance sheet, thinking about
But
the
but,
empire as a
but
balance.
I'm just thinking, I understand some of that, but it seemed to be counter to what had happened in 1990, in the 1990s, with the good work that you guys were doing. Suddenly, this thing was galvanized and it came back with a force.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. I think it was partly in reaction to the new imperial history, and the threatening currents that complacent, self-comforting views of the past might be challenged now. It was partly in reaction to that. It was partly a continuation of older ways of justifying the British Empire, which date back, particularly, I guess, to the immediate um, post Second World War period, when the West was trying to justify its former colonial activities and prevent newly independent countries acceding into the Soviet sphere by saying, look, think about empire as a balance. Yeah, we were violent, we were aggressive, we were racist, but we gave you railways, we gave you education, and so on. So it's partly a continuation of that. And you see a lot of that sort of balance sheet idea in Neil Ferguson's Empire book. But it was also, as all history is, a reflection of the politics of its time in terms of the idea of the end of history, Fukuyama's ideas in terms of 9/11, and the idea of a growing rift between Western civilization and Islamic cultures. And much of Neil Ferguson's work was in the context of a US neoconservative project, effectively to rebuild American empire. So it was explicitly advocating intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, explicitly advocating that America act more like Britain had in the late 19th century, with this idea that the American Colossus needed to inherit Britain's mantle as the keeper of a world order. So it was pitched in terms of world peace and prosperity and globalization and integration and so on. But it was very much part of that American neoconservative project at that time, which has now morphed into the contemporary culture war, and people like Ferguson are playing an ever more extreme role, I think, within that culture war.
Well, I notice several of the platforms on YouTube and on Twitter and in Blue Sky and places. There's there's an extension of that. There's small groups like started small group like trigonometry has now developed a huge following, pressing forward with the idea that the old empire was a good empire, and that all of the colonial historians and professional historians in military history, we're all redundant and we're all bad people now.
Mm.
Can I just draw a question to you, which has troubled me? And that is, do you think maybe we academics and professional historians have maybe let ourselves down, perhaps not done a good job?
Yeah, I think I don't think that that would be fair to say. I don't think it'd be fair to my colleagues. I think the problem is that for most of the time, this kind of thing isn't their job. Public engagement is one small element of an academic's role. It's become more important, partly in response to all of this. But academics' roles are primarily to teach undergraduates. And certainly in the UK, nearly all of the revenue that enables our employment in universities comes from recruiting undergraduate students through their tuition fees. Research, pardon me, research has always tried to sit sometimes uneasily alongside teaching and alongside administration and management duties, which academics themselves perform too in universities. And what research we do is largely orientated to the kind of funding streams that would enable universities to survive. So it's peer-reviewed academic monographs, journal articles, and writing research grants, um, all of which operate within this sort of narrow sphere of other specialists judging our work as grant reviewers or as peer reviewers. And most of the income for our research comes through those grants or through the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which is a peer review grading exercise of research quality. So there's all sorts of institutional reasons why most academics spend most of their time not engaging with the politics of their subject in the world outside. It's not to say they're not influenced by it, but they're not addressing it and explicitly engaging with it. And I think you and I were talking before we started recording about how periods of illness has enabled us to do slightly different things as academics than we might otherwise have been able to do. And certainly in my case, one of the reasons why I've been sort of free to do a lot more public engagement stuff is that illness took me away from that routine, that mundane routine of teaching, administration, writing research articles that a few hundred people might read, and gave me the space to think about how I might use the expertise I'd acquired through doing all that for 30 odd years to engage with some of the misrepresentations of the empire in public discourse. So I think it's not so much that academics are letting themselves down. I think it's more that there are institutional barriers to academics being able to engage in this space.
See, I think that's very important, and I'm very pleased that you said that because constraints on academics are huge and don't have the free range that the critics and the people running these YouTube channels are able to get away with.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that you remind us of the fact that, you know, those rules still hidebound academics to, and to a certain extent, tie them to their work. Um,
And I think it also goes beyond that. It's not just about how much time and conceptual space we have to engage with public discussion. It's also about what we feel free to say. So, as professional academics, we're constrained by ethics, and by a mission to try to tell truths. You know, that's by no means an easy thing, and we could get involved in a huge philosophical discussion about what we mean by truth. But what I mean basically is that academics are expected to try to write accurately and honestly and holistically about their field. And we operate within guardrails, which try to ensure, they don't always work, but their purpose is to try to ensure we do that. Hence peer review. So when we write stuff, we have it reviewed by other experts so that they can tell us you've cherry picked the literature here. You've ignored this author or that author or this evidence just because it doesn't fit your argument. Sorry, but you're going to have to go away and try again. And we have to fill in ethical approval forms for research projects that we undertake, saying that we are going to stick to what the evidence allows us to say. We're going to make the data publicly accessible so that people can check our evidence, check that we're telling the truth as far as possible. So all of these sort of rules that professional academics tend to abide by. I'm not saying we all do all the time. There are problems, there are people who don't observe it, but most of us, most of the time, stick to these kinds of rules of basically truth telling, to sort of cut a long story short. None of that applies if you're a YouTube video maker, a politician, a blogger, even just a popular historian writing books that don't need to be peer reviewed and going for a commercial market or making your political case by manipulating history. You can say whatever you like. Um, and increasingly, people are saying whatever they like. And social media is further loosening the constraints on telling truth in the public sphere. And we all know about sort of falsifying history, post-truth politics, all those kinds of things that are encroaching on every academic domain. History isn't the only topic. Just think about climate science and climate denialism. That there's a whole new world of untruth, which academics want to try to combat, often don't have the time or the space to combat. And even when they do, what they can say is constrained by what they can evidence and what they know to be true. And often that's a lot more complicated and nuanced and a lot less compelling than the falsehoods against which they're contending.
Yeah, I entirely agree with you. I mean, one of the reasons why I pick the kind of history I do is so that I don't get caught being told off for plagiarizing one of my colleagues because I forgot to read his book. I'm not particularly happy to do original research all the time, but it's safe.
Yeah, that's right.
um, we could talk for a long, long time. Well, I could because I'm just enjoying myself. Would you like to just draw a line under what we've talked about and just mention how you see your field of work going forward in the future?
Um, in terms of my field of academic inquiry, I'm pleased that so much is still being done that adopts an appropriately rigorous, evidence-based, but also critical view of the British imperial past. So, the work on transatlantic slavery, for instance, a topic that much of this political backlash wouldn't want discussed, is flourishing despite that. Um, I'm worried though about the careers of many of the people who are doing this stuff. not just because there are just shrinking opportunities to get academic tenure anyway, but also because of how hostile the right-wing reaction is to their work. Many of the younger scholars doing this kind of stuff have been publicly excoriated, had their credentials questioned in the national press before they've even got their careers off the ground, not to mention physical threats of violence. So that's a great worry, but it's gratifying to see that the work is going on nonetheless. And I think that there are various fields of imperial history that are still flourishing and opening up. One area is more about the comparative and the interconnected histories of empires. So not the whataboutery that people on the right of politics want us to do. Many people want us to stop talking about the British Empire and deflect to the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire or whatever. So I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about really thorough work that tries to understand imperialism as an interconnected phenomenon that involves more than one empire at a time, and all the sorts of flows of people, ideas, practices, policies between different empires, and countervailing that, the forms of resistance to imperialism that also cut across the boundaries between different empires. And I see a lot of this kind of work as co-editor of the Manchester University Press monograph series, Studies in Imperialism, which is coming up to its 200th volume. And it's a real privilege to serve in that role because you see how much exciting work along all sorts of avenues, far too many for me to summarize here, is going on. So it's a flourishing field despite all the problems, and that gives me hope.
Well, that's a good point to end. Um, Alan, thank you very much for your time. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Pleasure.